Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anna Stewart, CNN correspondent based in London. It is wonderful to see so many of you here today. I won't bother welcoming you. You must have been well welcomed at this stage in the day, I would expect. Now, I am normally on a plane to somewhere, I'd say most weeks, racking up air miles and unfortunately racking up emissions, and I'm sure lots of you are too. And before I get our esteemed panel on stage to talk about the future of transport, raise your hand if you have taken a flight this year. I'm hoping it's everyone. You've not taken a flight? Yes, you have. I know you have. Right, don't be shy. Right, who has taken a flight that was powered by electric? An airship? How about hydrogen? Yeah, maybe in a few years, when I ask this question, everyone's arms will be in the air. For now, of course not. But here's a really interesting one. Of everyone who's been on a flight, and that's pretty much the entire room, who has flown on a plane fueled by a sustainable aviation fuel blend, SAF? And you know that you were on a flight with SAF? Was it advertised? We have someone in the audience. It is rare, 0.1%, actually less than 0.1% of aviation fuel is SAF right now. Again, this is something that will change probably in the much nearer future. Today we will discuss the future of transportation, what it looks like, what the technologies are, what the development is. But we're also going to talk about why it's taking so long to achieve and how long, what the time frame is for where we're going to get to. With that, I will ask you to think of some questions. We will have Q&A at the end of this session. Microphone will be going around, so please keep them coming at the end. But for now, let's introduce our panelists. So we have Haldane Dodd, who is the Executive Director of the Air Transport Action Group, ATAG. Welcome to the stage. We also have the man creating one future for transport, Tom Grundy, the CEO of Hybrid Air Vehicles. This is hybrid airships. They look incredible. Welcome to the stage. And Kata Cherub, a leading expert in global aviation at ICF. So I will head on over with them. Now, I confess we were in the green room for quite a long time, so we're about an hour through our panel at this stage. To recap, when we look at the future of transport, and I think for the purposes of today, we're looking 10 to 20 years' time. Where do you see it? What do you visualize specifically as being different about the way we travel then? Haldane, let's start with you.
Well, hello and good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I think actually it's not going to look all that much different. As disappointing an answer as that might be, I think we're going to probably experience, from a visual perspective, fairly similar process. But the question will be, how is it powered? And I think that's where a lot of the change will come from. Certainly in the area that we work in, trying to reduce the CO2 emissions from air transport, that's where our real focus is going to be. How do we bring in sustainable aviation fuel? Hopefully in 15 years' time, we're going to have a lot more than, maybe even more than 10%, more than 15% of our fuel being from SAF by then. I think we're going to start seeing some elements of electric aviation by then. In fact, I think we're probably going to see that before the end of this decade, but it's going to be fairly limited on fairly small aircraft on very limited routes. And around about that time, we might see some entry into service of some type of hydrogen-powered aircraft. Big question is, where will we use that hydrogen? Will it be used in fuel cells? Will it be used directly in the aircraft itself? We're still working on that as an industry, but I think there will be a big change in the energy system for aviation, much more than the visual system of aviation. Sorry.
You sort of burst the bubble very early for this session. So when we look at sci-fi and hoverboards through the air and hyperloops that go across the Atlantic, you're kind of saying that's not happening. But fine, it's going to be the stuff that fuels transport. But you may have a different view on this, Tom.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that aviation has been built off the lifeblood of kerosene right from the first flights, right? So we've had years and years, decades of optimizing around kerosene, and that's given us the system that we see around us, and it's going to take time to make change to that system. I think in lots of applications, the mid-2030s is when we're going to start to see different concepts come through that start to add to what we've got today in long-range aviation. Some of those might look quite different. You know, we're moving, in some cases, away from things that have got the behavior of kerosene, whether that's kerosene as we know it or sustainable aviation fuel, into hydrogen. Hydrogen's a different fuel. It's going to drive different design, and therefore different ways of flying will start to come in. It's going to take a little bit of a while, but they're going to be in the mix. And then you've got some of the work that's been being done over the last few years from my company in particular. We've been working since 2007 to bring a completely different form of aviation into the market, and that's really designed to address markets that are currently not very well served by aviation. There's a lot of the world that doesn't have access to our systems today. 8 out of 10 people around the world haven't got on an aeroplane yet. And it's also designed to give some different options, to give some flexibility where our transport systems are currently choked. And then on top of all of that, because it is a hydrogen-powered aircraft, it will bring zero emissions transport in this decade in the applications that it's going into. So we're starting to see that change come through. It'll take a little bit of a while, but it's starting from here.
Definitely want to dig more into airships, but first of all, Kata, your take on 10 to 15 years.
Thank you. And at the risk of this panel turning into an aviation panel, I'm going to fly the flag a little bit for the other modes of transport, because we forget that most trips and most passenger trips are by car. So I think that actually in terms of quantum of difference, the changes will evolve, will be on electric vehicles. There's still about less than 10% of cars today are electric, and I think that will have a big effect in terms of the transport. Also, other modes of transport, and I will talk about aviation plenty, but let's remember that there are similar changes afoot in shipping, with similar conversations going on around the fuel sources, around the technology. We're seeing quite a lot of developments in the electrification and shifting to hydrogen on shipping, both for freight and for passengers. And of course, rail, and particularly in Europe, there is a very strong push for modal shift, particularly on short haul. And I fully expect that to continue. The policy drivers are pointing in that direction. The technology is supportive of that. We already have a very efficient high-speed rail network across Europe, and that is being built out in other parts of the world. And that doesn't mean that I certainly don't envisage aviation shrinking as a result of train taking a greater share of these trips. I fully expect the train and the total pie will grow, because let's remember the future of transport in the next 15, 20 years, another billion people will be living on this earth who will have transport needs, and the growing class, exactly to your point, 8 out of 10 people have never flown, but how many of them have been in a car, how many of them wish to travel? So I think one of the main things that the transport industry as a whole, taking all modes of transport together, really needs to figure out is how do you cater for this continued very significant growth, more than doubling, I would say, in terms of trips taken, at the same time as actively reducing emissions. And I know we'll talk about that for aviation because it's a particular challenge, but let's not forget about all the other modes and all the other areas where technology shift and fuel change is driving the change.
And it's hard to know where to invest in and what infrastructure to prioritize when you are trying to shift both rail and planes and cars, and it all has to happen at the same time and have some interoperability for users to travel. Where's the hype? So this is where we've discussed some of the core components, I would say, of the future of transport, particularly fuel, electric, hydrogen, SAF. But what about some of the very sexy innovations that I see as a journalist going to lots of different tech summits around the world? I have lost count of how many flying taxi companies I have seen. What is the hype? Where is the transport that we think will not make the future? Or is overinvested in, perhaps? I know Haldane's got some opinions on this one.
Yeah, I do. So I think, particularly coming up from the aviation space, we're a very cautious industry, a very careful industry about the way that we approach things. And it's through years of building up our safety requirements and working with regulators on certification of new aircraft types and the way that we operate aircraft. So we're very cautious about the way we approach new things, and that's one of the reasons why SAF is not quite as big as you might expect, even though we started flying on it 7 or so years ago, is part of that cautious approach. When it comes to some of these new types of transport that are being talked about a lot, that are getting a lot of attention from media and also just in the sort of the internet space, you're finding people coming in from Silicon Valley that come with a tech-focused agenda or tech-focused approach to the way you do things, which, you know, if you're building an app, if you're building an internet platform, it's very trial and error. It's very, we'll just throw it out there and see what happens. We can't do that with people's lives. We have to be very careful about the way we approach things. And so you're finding a lot of hype coming into the space. And it's to be expected. There's some exciting ideas out there and some exciting things that could be developed. But when you look at it at a mass transit level, when you look at it across the entire global industry, having those standards in place, having the certification so that it's done right first time is really, really important. If you're asking me to sort of pick and choose technologies, I'm not necessarily going to do that. But I think that certainly we're seeing a lot of work in the eVTOL space. It's not really something that we work on because we sort of look at commercial aviation rather than intercity air transport. But I think you're going to find quite a lot of those will go by the wayside. But that's actually the way that venture capital works. They throw money at ideas, and some of it sticks, and some of it doesn't, and they make money off the things that do stick.
But don't you wish that money could be invested in the technology we know we need?
My preference would be that it all gets flowed into sustainable aviation fuel or hydrogen or some of the other things that we know have a future. But you know, it's not my thing to control, I guess.
I mean, what we see, just building on Haldane's point, is that there is indeed a huge amount of really cool technology out there. They're really exciting, genuinely innovative. What I certainly observe and absolutely plays into why so many of these ventures won't work out is that there is a disconnect between what is possible technology-wise, between what the regulatory environment is, and absolutely right, it is quite rightly a highly regulated industry, and I'm sure, Tom, you can speak to just how long it takes to work through the certification processes. But I think often most importantly, the commercials don't work. And I think so many people get so overexcited about the possibility of doing something that is very cool, looks sexy on a brochure, but actually these need to sustain themselves. Passengers need to pay the right fare to travel on whatever mode of transport it is for the A to B journey that you're trying to service. And I think this plays into the fragmentation of the industry. If you're a manufacturer, you're solely focused on, can I make the best, whatever it is. I don't want to single them out, but the fastest, the coolest, the most comfortable, the most environmentally friendly. But these new technologies often incur a huge amount of R&D cost, which needs to be reclaimed. Then there is the actual manufacturing. And then on a daily basis, you need to have enough of a customer base who actually wants to fly this. And some of the things that we do at ICF is providing that sense check of, well, who actually would travel on my service to a hub airport, or who actually might pay £500 for an 8-minute journey somewhere on a new technology. And I think often that's where these fall down, is once you start putting real money in and having to answer those difficult investment questions, that's often where stuff gets real and things tend to fizzle a little bit. Which is not to downplay that actually some of these really innovative things are ultimately where the future of transport will come from. You're just not entirely sure where it's going to come from. And there is, I do share with you that just the sheer number of some of these types of projects is, you can tell it's a bit of a bubble. One or two may well succeed, but it's not going to be such a revolution.
And you are the ultimate number cruncher, so I mean...
Thanks. I wear that badge proudly.
You see these innovations and you actually get to kind of try and predict, would this work, would this not work? But you also have to look at the demand not just for now, but for the future and who's going to use it in the future. And that must be quite a challenging outlook.
Well, it is challenging and it isn't, right? If we think about any demand for, and let's just call it air transport, most people travel because they're trying to get from A to B. So it's actually not rocket science to figure out how many people might want to travel in a given economy from point A to B. There's a huge amount of data out there, and then you segment it, you figure out, are you targeting the business traveler, the leisure traveler, what are they paying now, what is the time versus the cost? I mean, often this is where the high-speed rail versus air comes into play. And again, I don't want to be too much of a downer, but in my view, some of the hype is around these really long train journeys across Europe. Yes, that will appeal to younger travelers. It will appeal to those who are particularly conscious about their environmental impact. But let's also not forget that so many people are traveling because they need to get there fast. That's why aviation has been so successful. So if it would take me 17 hours to get to somewhere in Eastern Europe, Yes, I mean, that may well be appealing if I want to see places, if I want to stop off. That can be a wonderful journey, but for most people, an hour and a half flight will always win out. So I think that's really, it's understanding what market segment you're trying to serve, looking at how big that market is today, how are the different economies growing. Europe will be very different to what Southeast Asia is going to look like. So again, these things, you can work them out, but exactly, if once a new technology gets really excited and makes a compelling pitch, then sometimes it's easy to forget.
Yeah. And Tom, I would like to talk about your airship in this context, because who is it for? What is the market for a hybrid airship? And actually just explain, I've seen what it looks like, perhaps our audience haven't. Do feel free to Google, I won't be offended if you're on your phone. It looks both very futuristic, but also quite old, because it looks like a sort of old school Zeppelin in some ways.
Yeah, it's a modern technology brought to bear on some of those old challenges that we've seen and that are very relevant to us now in the 21st century. So let's test my powers of description. What we've got here is an aircraft that's best thought of as being intermediate between what we have in fast jet transport today and what we do over the surface, whether that's getting on a ferry or getting on a train or driving. So it's in an intermediate space. It looks very different. It is very big. So as a passenger on an airlander, you would expect to have a business class level of space being delivered to you at around about an economy class level of price for your journey. And the whole setup is a different set of features and benefits for the passenger compared to what we have when we get on board an airline. So for example, Airlander unlocks point-to-point connections. So it can take away some of the consolidation that we've necessarily needed to go to because of the economics of today's air transport. It opens up our abilities to connect into parts of the world that aren't well served by today's transport infrastructure because it doesn't need the airports that we understand, as we understand them today, to be built in order to get it flying. It's got markets for domestic air transport. So our launch airline will be moving people in and around Spain and the Spanish islands. On the short sectors where we currently put regional jets in to those sectors because that's all we've got. On those really short sectors, if you think about that flight, a lot of your journey is dominated by getting to the airport, getting on board getting through the system, getting on board the aircraft, and then getting into and out of the city that the airport's attached to. Here, we're offering and of course that fast jet is only a benefit to you for the kind of the 20 to 45 minutes you're actually in the air. So here what we do is we take some of the comfort of the ground environment, put that on board the aeroplane, give people that space to be in, and then their journey time over those sectors is typically within about half an hour of the end-to-end journey of the flight. The big difference is that when you walk off that flight on our aircraft at the other end of your journey, you've emitted only 10% of the emissions of a regional jet on that sector, and that's the big discriminator there for us right now. In addition to that, logistics, there's very little freight that needs to fly around the world at 500 miles an hour. Only 1% of our freight goes by air at the moment by volume. It's 35% of the value because it's all the high value stuff, but actually a lot of that doesn't need to fly at 500 miles an hour and have the carbon footprint it does, and there's 99% of freight at the moment that goes over the surface. And additional markets then in long endurance flying for things like surveillance. Just listening to the challenges along the way, what you both said really reflects the journey that we've had bringing that technology into the market. It's been 15 years for us. We needed to get the technology right. The R&D phase is something we do very well in this country. It's very well supported. You can do that basic technology research, get up to prototype and fly. We actually bootstrapped a lot of that. We took a lot of our funding from customers as we went through, so very little venture capital, mostly interested customers coming alongside. But if you're going to disrupt something, you've got to tell the regulator and you've got to get their agreement. And in aerospace, you're not going to get that agreement. Yeah. So time to market is really driven by that relationship with the regulator and bringing the regulator with you, bringing people and your customers with you, and getting the economics right, as well as the technology and the certification.
I definitely want to. Oh, sorry, Harding.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that what we tend to find with a lot of the startups that are coming into this space is they're saying, we're going to be flying in 3 years, we're going to be flying in 5 years, you'll be able to do this, it's fine, the problems are solved. The reality is that's just not the case. And some of these technologies are really interesting and very exciting, but let's not oversell what the challenges are to get us there. And I think your journey's sort of shown that.
Well, 15 years of those challenges being steadily put behind us. We now have certification basis in place with our regulators. We've got the customer base there. We've got the technologies, the place we want it. Now we're going through the last challenge, which is scale up finance and scale up capital to get into manufacture. That's always a difficult challenge in any industry. Air transport is capital intensive, so that's kind of the last step along the way for us. But you put all those behind you, that's 15 years worth. We'll be in service with Airlander in 2026 with our first customers, so that's, flash to bang, a mere 19 years.
And this is lower emissions than your average aircraft, but that's not where you're going to finish. Am I right in saying that you're looking to have zero emissions, which draws on technologies that we're also looking at as the future of air transportation? So electric. Will we ever have entirely electric planes doing more than very short haul journeys? What do we think?
Define very short. We will have, and these are being tested right now. There are numerous orders out there for small electric aircraft going, not very far, a couple of 100 kilometers. Haldane might have the latest lowdown in terms of how far the current technology is being pushed, but nobody currently expects them certainly to fly transatlantic. And also size-wise, the battery technology does have a natural limit, so it's unlikely to be an A320, which is your typical narrow-body replacement as fully electric. But this is reality. This is using technology that is being increased, upgraded from cars. So we know that this is not revolutionary. This will happen, but it has a natural ceiling in terms of capacity based on the technology that we know today. So I don't consider that science fiction. I fully expect, and they use similar infrastructure. There are certainly challenges around having the charging infrastructure. If you think about the number of challenges in terms of uptake for electric cars, it's the same kind of thing. And we speak to numerous airports around the world who are being approached saying, you need to be ready for electric aviation, and the charging infrastructure is not there. They're not sure who's going to be coming, who's going to pay for that charging infrastructure. The utility company who needs to provide the extra electricity is not prepared, is not incentivized. This is why, to your question, why does this stuff take so long? It takes so long because there are so many stakeholders, each of them with slightly different priorities, each of them with different timelines, that makes it difficult. But electric aviation is happening. This will happen, and I think it will carve out a pretty valuable niche, particularly on those small hops, the islands, short haul, where flying still definitely has a benefit, but does not require 100 people at a time.
So how big a part of the future do we think electric aviation will be?
Oh, well, let me refer you to our ATAG waypoint.
My expectation is that probably by the end of this decade, we will see 19 seats, maybe a bit higher than that aircraft. It's probably not going to get much more than that until battery technology improves significantly from where it is today. There's just not the energy density there to get us to that point. What we are going to see actually is more and more electrification of aircraft systems on board, using electrical power for more parts of the aircraft. So some of the lessons that you learn through building electric aircraft, through building electric engines, you can reapplicate to other parts of the aircraft for sure. But I don't think we're going to probably see electric aircraft to be a very large part of the market. As Kat's point there about connecting communities that aren't otherwise serviceable with kerosene or jet-based aircraft, actually that's where aviation plays the most fundamental role to a community's lifeline. To be able to get out from very small communities to the outside world for education, for healthcare, for access to business, small tourism and things like that. Some of those roles are really, really important. So to be able to have electric aircraft on those routes is great. Where we look at it though, if we sort of look at where the technology can develop over the next 30 years, out to 2050, when we've signed up to say we're going to go net zero as an industry by 2050, the reality is that electric, hydrogen, even if it's slightly larger aircraft at a later stage, efforts like Tom's putting in here, are a pretty small part of the CO2 emissions of the entire industry. We look at where most of our CO2 emissions come from, it's from mid-range, long-haul aviation, and that's where we're going to need to turn to new types of energy, liquid energy through SAF.
And this is where we get less futuristic, because SAF exists now. I mean, the first flight took off with SAF a decade ago, I think. I get very frustrated, and I've been told off not to be so frustrated, but I get very frustrated because SAF makes up less than 0.1% of jet fuel. We all know this is the bridge to the future and probably will be a big part of our future regardless of what is innovated in terms of electricity and hydrogen. So, yeah, why has it taken this long, and will we see a much bigger uptake soon? Kata, I feel like you can kick us off with this one.
Money is your simple answer. Yep. People who I mean, so just for those who are not familiar, sustainable aviation fuel is called sustainable because over the life cycle of that fuel, the CO2 emissions are less than they would be from pure extraction. In very simple terms, it doesn't mean that there is no CO2 emissions from the actual usage of it. Also, very importantly, this is a drop-in fuel and it gets blended with the existing jet fuel. It's currently certified to be blended up to 50%. There is expectation and works for that to be increased. So just as there is no retrofitting required, this is not like hydrogen, this literally goes into the same
Which makes
tank.
it sound cheap, you don't need a new plane.
Ha. But so what's very different about it, and compare this to the infrastructure, the processes, the whole ecosystem for jet fuel, right? It gets extracted, it gets refined, it gets transported. There are a handful, let's call it a handful of refineries, of producers, of distributors, a pretty concentrated industry that's also very good at what it does. I mean, let's give them credit. They supply the fuel, it's of a high quality, it's consistent, everything's certified. Compare that with a completely new feedstock from a whole range of possible feedstocks. And the beauty of sustainable aviation fuel is that it can be made from a whole range of possible feedstocks. It can be made from, and this is the first generation, had a bit of a reputational issue for potentially conflicting with food sources. The current ones are absolutely designed not to. These will be residues from forestry waste, so the bits that can't be used for anything else. It can be the current generation are mostly used cooking oils and fats, waste that really cannot be used for anything else. That provides the feedstock, and that gets turned into through a pretty complicated process, but essentially comes out looking, smelling, using like jet fuel. So that's basically what SAF is. The reason, the problem, and the reason that the money is the reason that this hasn't taken off to a greater degree, is that building new refineries costs a lot of money. The technologies are new, so again, back to my point about the R&D that needs to be recouped. Our estimate is that to produce sustainable aviation fuel takes somewhere between 2 to 5 times as much the cost. So the production of the fuel the production cost is much higher than what an airline is able to purchase. So if you think about airlines being a pretty competitive industry, low barriers to entry, low profit margins. Unless airlines are being compelled to do something, there's very little incentive for them to spend 4 times as much on something that is their largest variable cost. So it makes complete sense for an airline, which is a commercial entity, not to voluntarily spend more than it needs to. Now, voluntary is a spectrum, and clearly airlines are under increasing consumer pressure, corporate buyer pressure, societal pressure to seem to be doing something. But the desire to do something is not sufficient. Somebody has to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in building a refinery, and they need some certainty that once they've built that refinery, somebody's actually going to pay the price that will allow them to make a return. So it does come down to money. The reason I'm not as pessimistic and as frustrated as you are is that we do actually see that there is a huge amount underway, and policy is really important in driving the change. There's again a very good reason why 90+% of the SAF in use today comes from California. That's because there are incentives and credits in place that make it economically viable for this to be produced and to be purchased. There's a huge amount of catch-up, and I would absolutely commend ATAG and Haldane in doing a great amount of education and advocacy work to raise awareness about this with governments. But the only way that this is going to ramp up is if the policies are in place to close this gap. I know you've got lots more to add on this, so I'll stop monopolizing, but that's basically it, and we are seeing this unlocking. I'm sure, Haldane, you can touch on what's going on in Europe and further afield, but there are plans afoot, and there is a lot more SAF coming.
But the big issue is money. So which stakeholder does it take to invest in the future of SAF? Or is it all stakeholders?
Yeah, it's an all of the above to a certain extent, but I would also just add this. The reason I'm optimistic about this is because we've just been through the worst time in aviation history from a business perspective. Worst time in tourism industry as well. During COVID, we went from having, before COVID, $7 billion worth of forward purchase agreements from airlines for SAF to now $25 billion. During the worst period in our history where finances were tight, where we were worried about every last dollar that was going to be spent, we increased the amount of SAF forward purchase that was underway. During that time, the industry agreed that we would go for a net zero 2050 goal. We also had a whole range of airlines say that they would like to aim towards 10% SAF by 2030. And that is now probably going to be the case in the UK, from a government perspective, that there will be a 10% SAF. The US government has stepped in behind through a slightly different approach than Europe has, but they've also said around about 10% of their fuel supply will be SAF in 2030. So yes, very low levels today. I think we're going to get to around about 2% globally of our fuel use being SAF by 2025, and I think without actually that much more push than what we have at the moment already, we'll get to around 6.5–7% by 2030. It probably can go higher than that. So I'm fairly optimistic that that's going to be the case. What we do need is finance from the investment community. And actually, there's a lot more interest now in building sustainable aviation fuel than we've ever had before. We need to do a bit more work in that area, for sure. But institutional investors, pension funds, these big funds that need to have long-term bond-style investment, look at SAF as a real opportunity because it is long-term, it is an energy source that they haven't invested in already, and so there is actually real interest.
You could even get to carbon accounting at this stage, which I don't think we should.
Let's not bore everybody.
We'll lose them.
The other area, as Kata said, is the policy space. And so for the last year, we've been asking governments to agree a long-term climate goal for the aviation industry. 3 weeks ago, they did that through the United Nations. We now have a UN-backed net zero goal for the aviation sector, only a sector in the world that has that as a standard from that sense. What that does is provide global policy certainty that we do need to move towards this area. Next year we're going to hopefully follow that up with a goal specific around SAF at a global level. So what that does is mean that governments around the world are incentivized to actually put in policies to help us get to where we need to from a SAF and from a climate perspective as well.
Just to add to that, I think the airlines just are doing a great job of finding ways through planning a transition and managing a transition and taking the sort of voluntary actions that you've talked about. But speaking as somebody on the design side of the aircraft industry, I think you can't let that stop us challenging to find better solutions that those airlines can turn to in the future. Yeah. We're in a energy transition here, not just in aviation, not just in transport, but in our whole society. And whilst the transition to SAF is very attractive and I think will definitely be a part of our long-term future because it's drop-in, because the energy density is the only thing that really works for some sectors of aviation, there is a huge bit of heavy lifting that can be done by hydrogen here. I'm not talking about just our product, I'm talking about generally. Work done out of the UK, out of the Aerospace Technology Institute last year really showed a path forward that for everything other than the very longest sectors that we have in aviation today, hydrogen aircraft can get there. For those longest sectors, that's just one stop, one layover, which we're used to on a lot of flights anyway. So I think this is a case of both and, not either or. And you asked about hype earlier on. I think it's equally dangerous to lock in on SAF as the only thing, because SAF will have costs. We do have a big transition. It will be costly. Kerosene's currently untaxed, so there's a big difference between those cost bases right now. We've got to manage that. But once we've managed it, producing biofuel could use feedstocks. It could use carbon captured from the air. It's going to use energy. It will need hydrogen in that value chain, and all of those are resources that we need for all of our industries, not just for aviation. So we can move to hydrogen wherever we can. Then we're taking energy needs out and being responsible citizens within the broader transport infrastructure that we've got.
And what sort of role do you see regulators having to encourage all of these different technologies? And we can talk about, often I look at Europe and its regulation in Europe because I'm a European correspondent, but beyond Europe, and Europe's big into sticks as I understand it, and other regulators more into carrots. What works and what do we need to see to encourage not just SAF, but all these different technologies at the same time?
Well, for me, it's a blend of interventions. So I think much more about the early stage adoption of technology. So we need to continue investing in research and development. That's a fundamental. We also need to recognize the challenges that we've talked about here in terms of bringing these technologies to market. We often see support for nascent technologies drop away just at the point they're almost ready to go. Just at the point where you're going through that 10 times scale up of your cost base, of your infrastructure to get into manufacture. I think that's equally true of sustainable aviation fuel as it is of a technology like ours, where that investment to scale up refineries is the same as the investment needed to scale up a production line for a new type of airplane. So governments can play a really key role there. They need to be prepared to do things like take little equity stakes in companies at the right point, provide that market signal, crowd in investment from the private sector, back those technologies they think are going to win and go for it. And the last thing I'd say is recognize it's not a level playing field. As we bring these new technologies in, you're competing against an aviation ecosystem that's global and is generally globally untaxed in terms of the fuel source that it's using. So when I sit here and say, well, my product is cheaper to operate than the regional jets on that route, I mean it. And that's with the costs of energy that we're paying and the costs of the developments that we've made set against an untaxed price of kerosene. And one way or other, that kerosene price will go up over time. But those sort of contracts for difference, those sort of incentives that governments can play in early, make a big difference to the adoption path and the rate that we can do things.
So on the policy side, there are a menu of different options that governments can turn to. So you're right in saying that Europe really tends to focus on the stick approach, i.e. putting in place a mandate. You will use X amount of SAF in your flights from this date. US has used an incentive-based approach, fairly similar to what we saw with wind or solar energy, where you're incentivized to use it certainly in the early stages until it gets a grip in the market and is able to sort of exist by itself. Whichever way you go, actually there's no one solution for every country in the world. Each country has its own environment that you need to operate within. So having that menu of options available is really important. I think on the Europe approach, the mandate approach, what's really important to know is instead of just having the mandate, you must use X amount of SAF, you need to also provide the backup to make sure that SAF is available. Otherwise it just becomes a tax. It becomes a scarce resource that all airlines are fighting for to pay, to use. It also potentially incentivizes cowboys to get into the market, which is exactly what we saw with biofuels in the sort of first generation of biofuels for use in cars, and we saw that, the problems that come along with that from land use and water use and so forth. So it's important to make sure that you do things in the right way, that if you're going to put in place a mandate, you have a package of measures to help support that mandate and not just have a blunt mandate by itself. But I think it also brings the other point that we can't just talk about Europe or North America here. We have to talk about the world and other countries in the world as well, because if we're going to decarbonize aviation, or if we're going to decarbonize any other part of our transport system, we can't just think about those things that rich countries can afford to do. It needs to be something that can be exported around the world and be in place for all citizens around the world, because we don't just exist in two regions of the world, and the question of carbon, the question of decarbonization of our entire economy has to be able to take place everywhere, not just here.
Kata, what do you think in terms of regulation? Can it be improved? It feels quite fragmented.
Yeah, and it is a challenge. I'm sympathetic to regulators because these industries are complex, and many of us spend entire careers focused on one element of transportation or one element of energy. So for somebody to be sitting in Brussels or sitting in Delhi or sitting in Washington to try and put in place a policy regime that thinks ahead to all of the clever ways that people will find loopholes, it's fiendishly difficult. So, first of all, it's very easy to bash the regulators, but it is actually very difficult. I think what is very important is to consult, and for consulting with the industry not to be simply lip service, but to actually listen to the concerns of industry, because industry are going to be the ones who have to follow these rules. And what I see, when this works well, when regulators actually do follow and take that on board and revise and tweak accordingly, then that the regulation, whatever it is, will be flexible enough to last the test of time. New things will come up, that it will be taken on board, and that it will have the desired impact. When things don't work out that way, it's usually when it's something quite dictatorial. Somebody somewhere had a good idea, they pushed it out, and then 5 years later, it's become evident that it hasn't worked. But I mean, just on Haldane's point about developing countries, I think it is a really important one, because particularly on SAF, but also on some of the other technologies that are in development, I think the nuance of it gets lost on policymakers who are either trying to punish and squeeze out the bad behavior, which is, it could be emissions, it could be noise, it could be local air quality, whatever it is, and then keep that quite separate from some of the real positives that might also be around that. And just for SAF as a case in point, I mean, one of the really important things that I think needs to be taken into account when you think about what policy will have the desired impact is how is it produced, how many jobs does it create, what kind of energy security might it provide to your local economy? And it doesn't have to be SAF. This could also be renewable diesel for trucking or other industries. And I think in SAF's case, the fact that these refineries are going to be much smaller than your traditional oil refineries. The feedstock will generally be collected near to the refinery. So typically these refineries will create jobs, whether it's collecting municipal solid waste from the local landfill or forestry waste or used cooking oils. There are many positives, and I think that's the challenge for the regulator, is something that takes that wider view, not just I must tax this because I believe this is wrong. It's about how can I craft something that, yes, absolutely addresses the negative impacts, but doesn't strangle some of the innovation that might be happening elsewhere.
So we've talked about, who needs to get involved in this, you asked. We've talked about governments, we've talked about finance institutions. We haven't talked about the energy industry itself yet, and that's a big hole. We have not seen enough progress in developing SAF or hydrogen, actually, for that matter, from the traditional oil companies.
You don't think we've seen enough?
We've hardly seen any at all. And they've got the money, they've got the expertise, they've got the
and they've got the targets. They're all meant to be, zero emissions by whenever.
They've got the distribution networks. So they are the right place to actually get this done. If we think about how much it's going to cost for us in aviation, specifically to transit to sustainable aviation fuel, we think that we're going to probably need about $1.5 trillion worth of capital investment in SAF production facilities.
I'm sorry, $1.5 trillion?
$1.5 trillion between now and 2050. That's about 48 billion a year on average, okay? Which is around about 6 or 7% of traditional oil and gas capital expenditure. So it's not out of the realm of possibility. 48 billion is also the amount that Saudi Aramco made in profits in the last 3 months alone. So there's money out there to do this. They really need to get behind it, and they're not doing enough already.
That is such an excellent point. Listen, I'd like to end with you, Tom. If you could fix one thing to get your technology off the ground, to make it happen, what would it be? What's your biggest challenge right now?
Oh, we've fixed the challenges really to get the technology off the ground. So if I just go through what I would have said to you a few years ago, technology first. We've got new materials sciences, new approaches that we can take in the supply chain that have unlocked our ability to do this differently. Economics second, so design a product that economically fits. We all refer to what we do as an airship every so often. Really, it's a hybrid aircraft. It's a different form of technology, and it's designed to operate on and off the ground like other aircraft do for economic reasons, so get the economics right. Talked about certification, we've talked about scale-up finance, but there's one last piece, which is perception. And so we all lock on to what we know, don't we? We're all used to what a flight on an aircraft is. We all get to the airport, get on board that aeroplane. If you're me, you squeeze into the middle seat, and that's the experience that we have watching the screen right in front of us. And that's great, and we're convinced that's exactly what we want from that flight because it's what we're used to. For us, we've packaged the benefits of that journey in a completely different way. And it's taken us a long time to get people's minds moving that actually if you do this differently, it can be better. It can be cheaper, it can be a nicer experience, and it can get you there on time. And make a difference to, in our case, the 7% of aviation emissions that's in regional and domestic transport. But hey, 7% of a sector that could represent 25 to 50% of global emissions by 2050. If we get this transition wrong, that's worth having, right? We can make that difference quickly. So it's been getting the perceptions right about the experience and what this really means for people. That's been the big deal, and that's got launch customers on board, and that's what gets the technology moving.
And the first passenger journey, 2026?
2026, passenger journeys. You can join 99 other people in that business class space, flying around Spain with our launch airline customer, Air Nostrum, from 2026.
I'm wondering whether I'm going to be on that first or a flying taxi first. Who knows? I'll have to check back in a few years.
Come to us
with
first.
that guy.
Now, questions. Any questions from our audience for our lovely panelists? I can see a hand shooting up there. Let's get you a microphone. I cannot hear you. I don't think the microphone works. This is tragic. I might have to just pull you up on stage.
Are we on? Here we go. Yeah. I think you're right about SAF. Two questions. Feedstock. I think there's problems with things like cooking oil. Is there enough? Something like alga. I suspect there's quite a lot. You're probably okay there. Path. It really comes down to cost. I did quick calculations. I reckon that, let's say £2,000 a tonne into tanks. That's $250 barrel, $6 per US gallon. Rather more than we pay now. Aircraft might get efficient. Two questions. One, can we achieve that? And will the economics actually work at that sort of cost? Or might even be pessimistic, cost could be a bit lower?
Who wants to tackle this one? Haldane.
Sure. So when we were working with governments to get the agreement at the UN a few months ago, we did a specific piece of work looking at the cost of getting to net zero. And yes, there is going to be a cost. It is going to cost more to move to SAF than we are currently paying on fossil fuel. But that we're currently paying on fossil fuel. We don't know what the cost of fossil fuel will do by itself as an underlying cost, but we also need to make sure we take into account the cost of carbon that's going to be applied across the business. And that's not just through taxes, through emissions trading schemes or other things, but it's also just the cost of us doing business if we don't have that net zero pathway. The cost of insurance will go up, the cost of financing our fleet and financing our facilities will go up as well. So we've sort of baked all that in. It's very, very hard for me to tell you exactly what's going to happen to an airfare, because actually the airfare today that you pay is not particularly reliant on the underlying cost of the fuel in particular that goes into that. It's a whole range of different things. We think, however, that in some parts of the world where flying is relatively cost efficient today, Europe being one and the US being another, you might see some slight increase in ticket prices. But actually in a lot of other parts of the world where you see a lot of growth happening, there's still room for efficiency in the way that the pricing model is produced today for airline tickets. There's a lot of inefficiency built into the system there from a range of different things, not just from the cost of energy itself. So I'm not sure you're going to see a huge increase in the cost of air travel. You might in some parts of the world, but there's still room for efficiency improvements to bring down that cost overall.
Great question. Sorry, what was your second one? Did we answer both?
There was the question about, is there enough feedstock?
Oh, enough feedstock.
Because there are different technologies.
I mean, the feedstocks are, it's not just used cooking oil, and you're absolutely right. There certainly isn't enough used cooking oil in the world. No matter how many McDonald's we eat, until 2050, that will not be enough to make 400 million tons of SAF, which is what the Waypoint report estimates that we need to make. The opportunity is to use those current generation technologies and feedstocks as the starter, because they are proven. All of the current SAF producers are following this so-called HEFA pathway, which uses the used cooking oils. But then beyond that, there comes the alcohol to jet, the power to liquid, which will start to mature and will also start to come down in price as they get proven out. They're prohibitively expensive at the moment, but they will come down in price as more, and similar to the renewables example which Haldane used. So you're right, there isn't enough used cooking oil, but when you take all of the other feedstocks into consideration and the next generations, and then beyond that, when you are looking at power to liquid, provided you've got sufficient green hydrogen, green electricity, then it's limitless in theory in terms of how much you can produce. So you can absolutely produce enough. I would direct you to Atag's work in this space. There's a huge amount of detail available on the particular technologies and the financing costs.
If you want a really good read, Waypoint 2050, first and second edition. Very meaty, but lots of good stuff on SAF. Kept me company on a long haul flight. Right, any other questions? We've got red arm. I can see it's attached to a woman.
It's difficult for us to see up here.
Yeah, sorry, it is really bright.
There's one behind you.
It's behind you.
Hello.
Hi.
Liz Mosscrop with Gear Up TV. When, if ever, will I be able to get an airship up to John Lennon Airport to go and see my sister?
Well, it's definitely not before 2026, is it?
Yeah, it depends where you're starting from. From London. So I talked about perception earlier on. One of the things that we've really started from and said to people very explicitly is, don't expect to get on an airlander from London to New York. This is not what this is all about. This is about shorter sectors. It's about taking away the points where we put today's tools of regional jets into places where they're really inefficient. And you make a really interesting point about the UK. The UK's got really pretty, despite the challenges of moving around by train today, we've got pretty good rail infrastructure here in the UK and in a lot of Europe. So what we look at for the entry points for Airlander are the places where policy is pulling us towards net zero quickly, and where geography really means that it's hard to make regional jets work, regional aviation work, as well as it can do elsewhere in the world. So let's take a couple of examples. Spain's worked really well for us. Net zero policy, pressure on the airline industry there, geography involving lots of islands and the travel to and from and around, and distributed cities around a landmass. In France, where you've got decades of investment in high-speed rail and TGV, it's not going to be such a good economy for us to come into. So what I would say to you is take your sister on a trip from John Lennon Airport to Belfast or across to Dublin, and because those are the sectors where technology like ours will come in very early. The Highlands is another great example where we're working with Highlands and Islands and other parties as well on logistics actually in that sector. So as we scale our business, we're taking our platforms from things directed more towards passenger transport up into the logistics world. It needs a little bit more scale. And the logistics challenges in those networks are really extreme. There are passenger challenges as well, and it's exactly the sort of geography in the UK that would work really well with an Airlander solution.
I think maybe just to add to that point as well, if we think about mobility as a whole and our need to connect places and people, we also need to do a better job, I think, connecting different transport modes. We've talked about intermodality a lot and having, it works in some places. In Germany and France, air rail tickets work very, very well. I live in Switzerland, it works very well there. You buy a ticket on Swiss Airlines from Geneva to Mumbai, and the trip to Zurich might be on a train or might be on an aircraft. But it works very well. The interconnectedness works. But that needs to you need to make sure that the policy space, particularly when it comes to rail infrastructure, is putting the rail in the right places as well. The fact that we've got High Speed 2 in the UK, which is not connected to Heathrow in a proper sense, is ridiculous. But having that ability to connect and make the passenger journey easy and desirable, that they want to do that, and then the ticketing, the ticketing's easy to sort out, but the actual physical connections are really important.
But also, you just said desirability, and what I'm interested in is there is someone who already wants to be, I think, on one of your airships, which is good news, isn't there? Two customers.
I knew you wouldn't be the only one.
I think we've got room for one more question. Yes, gentleman here.
Thank you. I came a little late because I was busy drinking Italian wine next door.
You did hear. It sounds a lot of fun.
It was very delicious, but so since I came over here, I heard a lot about the supply side. You all talked a lot about the supply side. I just missed a little bit from the demand side. You were talking about SAF, for example. Are you doing, I don't know what you're doing to sort of stimulate demand. Can you tell us maybe a little bit about the role of demand, where somebody would say, okay, I have this choice between regular fuel and SAF, for example, and I'm going to choose SAF because, I don't know, because from the supply side, you're doing certain things that, that would sort of stimulate this demand. I don't know what needs to be done in order for somebody to choose it and put pressure from the demand side to say, okay, this is something I want, and therefore more demand is coming from that side. Does that make sense?
I feel like there's a mixture in terms of the demand, but Kata, maybe this one's for you.
Well, it depends who you think about it as your demand. Is your demand your passenger? In which case, if it's just the individual passenger, honestly, they're not going to move the needle. And we see that in the percentage of people who voluntarily choose to either buy SAF, and you can certainly do this when in some of the Swedish airports, there is the facility to do that. They're pushing it hard, but most people at that point in their journey aren't in a position. Corporates, if you think of them as the demand, there is increasingly, and there's some really cool stuff going on in terms of pooling demand. As you can imagine, large corporates spend a lot on business travel, and therefore are keen to actually do something about reducing that. So we're seeing some interesting work being done in terms of SAF certificates being developed, different technology platforms, pooling demand. So in that area, then the fact that large corporations, for example, like your Microsofts or your Googles or whoever, have already made very large public statements or visible public statements that they're going to address them, that's driving a lot of the behavior. But if you think about demand as the airline, who is really the one producing it, that's why I said it sort of depends on what you mean by demand, then the airline, as per my earlier comment, which you may have missed, apart from societal pressure, there's very little without any additional incentive for an airline to choose to pay more for a large operating cost item. So unless there is a regulation, or if the airline or the airline's shareholders have made a commitment, which is increasingly the case. So if you think about who might own an airline, there are increasingly binding targets to 2050. They are making commitments, and it's not just the case that the CEO stands up, makes a commitment, then that trickles through to actual operations. And as Haldane has mentioned, for the next 15 years, it's really SAF. So if you want to actually address your CO2 emissions, you have to buy this fuel. And at the moment, and I'm sure, Haldane, you'll support me with some data on this, but there is no shortage of demand. What there is at the moment is a shortage of supply. Yeah. And there is a bit of a chicken and egg, and it is due to this cost difference because of the production costs and so on. But certainly our expectation is that production will rapidly increase, and then thereafter, due to a combination of mandates, societal pressure, net zero commitments, that will start to be purchased by airlines.
Yeah, there's definitely no shortage of demand if it's at the right price. And we don't necessarily mean parity with Jet A1 at the moment. Could be a little bit above. But as long as it's the right price, airlines will take it. You cannot buy SAF today in Europe because there's so much demand for it. We need the supply to catch up with that and then move beyond it to get the cost equation working properly.
Well, thank you for those excellent questions. And thank you to our panel. That was brilliant. It was really interesting. I can't wait to see the Airlander finally take off in Spain in 2026. And we'll see about the flying taxis. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.